March 1944, Berlin. Air raid sirens have become routine in the German capital by now, but what German fighter controllers see on their scopes this particular week is not routine at all. American bombers are overhead, as they have been for months. What is new, circling above them, is a small, single-engine escort fighter that has no business being this deep into the Reich at all. No Allied fighter has ever had the range to reach Berlin and fight its way back out. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, is told the fighters over the capital are American Mustangs. According to the account that has circulated ever since, Göring's response is immediate and stark. When he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. It is one of the most quoted lines to come out of the entire air war, repeated in documentaries, books, and museum placards for 80 years, treated as the moment German High Command finally admitted, to itself if no one else, that the strategic bombing campaign had beaten it. Pause on that. Here is the detail that makes that moment so strange. The aircraft causing this despair in the highest levels of German command was not an airplane the United States Army had wanted to build. It was not the product of a confident American fighter program racing to beat the Luftwaffe. It began as an afterthought, a design the U.S. military didn't order, initially flew with an engine that made it a mediocre high-altitude fighter, and might have stayed a footnote in aviation history if not for a British test pilot's stubborn hunch. This is the story of how the P-51 Mustang went from a fighter nobody in Washington asked for to the aircraft that made Germany's air marshal believe the war was already over. Part 1. An airplane America didn't order. The Mustang exists because Britain, not the United States, needed fighters in 1940 and needed them fast. The British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation that spring, hoping the company would simply build Curtiss P-40s under license to speed up delivery. NAA's president, Dutch Kindleberger, had a different idea and put the question to his chief designer, Edgar Schmood. Did they really want to build someone else's already aging design? Schmood's answer became the starting point for the entire program. Don't build an obsolete aircraft, build a new one. The British agreed on one condition that would define the rest of the story: deliver a working prototype fast. North American's team completed the NA-73X prototype in just 117 days, and it first flew on October 26, 1940. The British ordered it directly, under the name Mustang 1, powered by an American Allison V1710 engine. The United States Army Air Corps was not the customer. It was, at best, an interested bystander, taking two early production aircraft for its own evaluation, almost as an afterthought, to a program built for someone else's Air Force. The speed of that 117-day development effort is still remarkable by any standard of aircraft design, before or since. North American's engineers worked essentially around the clock, borrowing aerodynamic research on laminar flow wing design that was, at the time, still experimental. A wing shape intended to reduce drag by delaying the point at which airflow over the surface became turbulent. It was a technically ambitious choice for a company racing a deadline, and it paid off in exactly the way that would matter 2 years later. An airframe clean and efficient enough that, once given the right engine, it would outfly nearly everything else in the sky. Part 2. The engine that held it back. The Allison engine that powered the earliest Mustangs was a capable unit at low and medium altitude, but it lacked a second-stage supercharger, and above roughly 15,000 feet, its performance fell away sharply. Precisely the altitude band where the war's most consequential fighter combat over Europe was actually happening. The U.S. Army Air Corps, evaluating the type, did not see a future air superiority fighter in it. Early American Mustangs and the closely related A-36 Apache dive bomber variant were assigned to tactical reconnaissance and ground attack squadrons, rather than to the fighter groups tasked with contesting German airspace. It is not quite accurate to say the U.S. military rejected the Mustang outright. It bought the aircraft and put it to work. But it is fair to say the branch of the American military that mattered most for this story, High Altitude Escort Fighter Command, looked at the airplane and saw a competent, low-level workhorse, not a future legend. Pilots flying the Allison-powered version in the ground attack role generally liked what it did well. It was fast at low altitude, handled cleanly, and could absorb battle damage that would have ended a flight in a less rugged airframe. None of that mattered to the officers deciding which fighter type would escort heavy bombers into contested German airspace at 25,000 feet and above, where the Allison's power curve fell apart and left the pilot flying an airplane that could neither outclimb nor outfight the German fighters waiting for the bombers at altitude. The A-36 Apache variant, fitted with dive brakes for a dedicated ground attack role, saw hard combat over Sicily and Italy in 1943, flying missions that had nothing to do with the high-altitude escort mission that would eventually define the type's legacy. Pilots flying it in that role earned real respect for its ruggedness and diving speed. But the aircraft that fought over the Mediterranean in 1943 and the aircraft that fought over Berlin in 1944 were, in every performance category that mattered at altitude, functionally different machines wearing the same silhouette. Part 3. A British test pilot's hunch. The pivot point in this story belongs to a man most people watching this video have never heard of. In the spring of 1942, Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew an Allison-powered Mustang 1 and came away with a specific, focused conclusion. The airframe itself was excellent, aerodynamically cleaner and faster than almost anything else flying, but the engine was the wrong one for the job. Harker's report recommended trying a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine powering the Spitfire, in place of the Allison, betting that the Merlin's two-stage supercharger would fix the high-altitude weakness without sacrificing the airframe's other advantages. The idea met real resistance inside the Air Ministry in London, where officials were skeptical of diverting Merlin production toward an American airframe already assigned to secondary roles. Harker did not let the idea drop. Working through Rolls-Royce's Ray Dorey and eventually reaching Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfred Freeman, he pushed the proposal until it was approved for testing on both sides of the Atlantic. It is worth pausing on how close this idea came to never happening at all. Harker was not a senior official with the authority to redirect a strategic engine production line on his own say-so. He was a test pilot with a strong opinion and a report nobody in the bureaucracy was obligated to act on. Britain in 1942 had every reason to guard its Merlin production jealously. The engine was already committed to Spitfires and Lancasters, aircraft the Air Ministry considered proven and essential. Diverting even a handful of engines to an experimental conversion of an American airframe still assigned to secondary duties was, from a purely administrative standpoint, an easy proposal to shelve. That it was not shelved came down to persistence rather than any obvious institutional momentum behind the idea. Part 4. A different airplane entirely. The Merlin conversion did not produce a marginal improvement. It produced, by most informed assessments, a different airplane entirely. Fitted with the Merlin 61 in Britain, and later with a Packard-built license version of the Merlin, designated the V1650 in American production, the resulting P-51B and P-51C models gained exactly the high-altitude performance the Allison-powered version had lacked, while keeping the airframe's low drag and long range intact. That combination, genuine high-altitude fighter performance, paired with enough internal and drop tank fuel capacity to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and fly home again, did not exist anywhere else in the Allied inventory. Spitfires could fight at altitude, but lacked the range. Early Thunderbolts had range problems of their own before drop tanks matured. The Merlin Mustang could do both, and that combination was about to matter enormously. Test pilots flying the early Merlin conversions described a transformation that went beyond raw performance numbers. Where the Allison-powered Mustang had felt like it was running out of breath above 15,000 feet, the Merlin version kept climbing and accelerating well past that altitude, matching or exceeding the top German fighters, the Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, in the exact performance band where escort fighters needed to win. Combined with drop tanks that could be jettisoned once combat began, the P-51B and its refined successor, the bubble canopy P-51D, gave American bomber crews something they had never had before over Germany: a fighter escort that could stay with them from the English coast to the target and all the way home again, rather than turning back at the German border and leaving the bombers to fend for themselves through the most dangerous part of the mission. Part 5. Big Week and the Death of an Air Force. In late February 1944, the United States launched Operation Argument, a sustained bombing campaign against German aircraft factories that airmen at the time nicknamed Big Week. For the first time, American bombers pushing deep into Germany had fighter escort that could stay with them the entire way, and the Luftwaffe's fighter squadrons, forced to rise and defend their own aircraft industry, found themselves fighting Mustangs over their own airfields rather than picking off unescorted bombers at will. Between February 20th and 25th, roughly 17% of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilots were killed in air-to-air combat during that single week of fighting. It was not a number the German fighter arm could absorb and continue functioning the way it had. Adolf Galland, the general commanding Germany's day fighter force, later reported to his own air ministry that between January and April 1944, his squadrons lost more than 1,000 pilots, including a disproportionate share of the veteran squadron, group, and wing commanders who had trained and led the rest. Within weeks, Mustangs were escorting bombers over Berlin itself, a mission that would have been unthinkable for any Allied fighter just a year earlier. American fighter tactics shifted during this same stretch of the war in a way that compounded the damage. Where escort fighters had previously been ordered to stay close to the bomber formations they protected, commanders increasingly released Mustang pilots to pursue German fighters more aggressively, including down to low altitude and back toward their own airfields, a change that turned every intercepted Luftwaffe sortie into a running fight the German pilots could not simply disengage from by diving away. The cumulative effect across the spring of 1944 was not just a high casualty count. It was the steady destruction of an Air Force's institutional memory, the loss of exactly the pilots capable of training the next generation quickly enough to replace what had just been lost. Part 6. Correcting the Legend. Here the story needs an honest correction, because the most famous line associated with this moment is usually told wrong. Popular retellings, including more than a few documentaries, attribute the "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost" quote to Adolf Galland, the dashing young fighter general whose own writings and post-war interviews made him the public face of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. The historical record points elsewhere. The remark is attributed to Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe's commander-in-chief, not to Galland, and it deserves to be remembered correctly, because the two men represented very different vantage points on the same catastrophe. Goering watching his air force lose the ability to defend the capital of the Reich itself, and Galland watching the specific, irreplaceable loss of the experienced pilots who had made that air force dangerous in the first place. Conflating the two flattens a more precise and more interesting picture. German high command lost the strategic argument at the same moment German squadron leaders were losing the tactical war on the ground, in the officer corps, pilot by pilot. Galland's own post-war writing and interviews did plenty to cement his reputation as the Luftwaffe fighter arm's most articulate voice, which likely explains why the quote drifted toward his name over decades of retelling, even though the historical attribution belongs to Goering. It is a small error in the scheme of the whole story, but it is exactly the kind of small error this channel exists to catch, because getting the right man's despair attached to the right words matters if the story is going to be told honestly rather than just memorably. There is a second correction worth making too, about the word American doing more work than it should in a title like this one. The Mustang's airframe was American, its original order was British, and the engine that turned it into a legend was British as well, built under license by an American company once the value of the idea became impossible to ignore. The single most important decision in this entire story, swap the engine, was made by a Rolls-Royce test pilot, pushed through a skeptical British bureaucracy, and only afterward adopted at scale by American production lines. The Mustang's fame is often told as a purely American triumph. The honest version is a joint one. A British specification, an American airframe, a British test pilot's insistence, and eventually American manufacturing scale, combining into a fighter neither country could have produced to this standard alone. None of this diminishes what North American aviation's engineers achieved with the original airframe, and none of it diminishes the scale of what American factories eventually built once the design was proven. Thousands of P-51s rolled off production lines by the war's end, cheap enough and numerous enough to equip escort groups across the entire 8th Air Force. But scale and mass production came after the idea was already validated by a much smaller, much less certain chain of decisions made by a handful of specific people whose names rarely make it into the shorter version of this story. By the war's end, the P-51 had become the definitive long-range escort fighter of the European Air War, credited by American planners with helping secure the air superiority over France that made the Normandy landings possible at all. Fighter groups flying the Mustang would go on to claim more aerial victories over Europe than any other American fighter type of the war, a record made possible only because the aircraft could actually reach the fights that mattered, over German airspace, at the altitudes German fighters preferred to operate in. Bomber crews who had spent 1943 watching their fighter escort peel away at the German border, leaving them to fly the rest of the mission exposed, began seeing the same small silver fighters waiting for them on the way home from Berlin, Munich, and every other target deep inside the Reich. That single change in what an escort fighter could physically do reshaped the entire strategic bombing campaign's odds of success. It started as an airplane the U.S. military didn't ask for, flying on an engine that limited it to secondary duty, saved from obscurity by one persistent test pilot's report that almost nobody in London wanted to act on. 2 years later, it was the aircraft that convinced the commander of the Luftwaffe the war could no longer be won, however exactly and by whomever those words were actually spoken. Subscribe if you want the next chapter in the story of the aircraft history almost forgot.